This is the science fiction novel by Ashley Hornbaker, titled Beyond Bermuda, Evil Within the Rift. Prelude. Hal's feet sank into the marshland with every exhausting step. The land surrounding him was barren and dead as the leafless trees hung low, their branches dipping into the soil, and a cold, murky fog lingered just above the ground. There was no wind, and the only sound came from the mud as his feet penetrated its surface. The thick fog clung to his skin as he passed through, paddling his arms as if it would help push it out of the way. The dense moisture settled on his skin, leaving an unusual residue that trailed down his arms and bare chest with gray streaks. It was calm now as he cautiously peered through the haze, but he knew that could change at any moment. He glanced down at his watch and smeared away the film that covered the glass. The arms stood still, as did the compass, which he'd grown accustomed to after so many days, yet he still held out hope that some sort of normalcy or measurement would start ticking away again. The sky was dim and gray, giving an omnipresent gloom over the land that never seemed to change. There were no significant landmarks or objects that stood out among the rest, just a never-ending marshland and an ever-present time. There were no day or night cycles either, and without a functional clock he could only guess how long he'd been lost. Forward, just move forward, he told himself. He felt the jolt as time began to shift. It was an odd sensation, one he might describe much like a punch to the head. There was a twist, almost painful as a feeling slammed into your body. Then there was a slow motion as you absorbed the shock, temporarily forgetting the unusual sensation. Lastly, the recoil as your mind snaps back, the pain of the impact and the struggle to find your center of gravity again. Hal felt as the shift began and crouched down, gripping his knees as he waited for the push. Time slowed and he breathed in, closing his eyes as the bright flare of light sparked. It was an unexplainable phenomenon that had been happening every couple of hours. He wasn't even sure if the event was real or psychological, but for several days it had been occurring consistently. After a dozen times, he'd learned to recognize the signs and brace himself for the shift. All movement seemed to pause, and the first spark of green light appeared, flickering ever so briefly. He frantically looked to his side, trying to catch a glimpse of it, but it vanished too soon. The chaos was about to begin. The second phase slowly faded in as a low horn began to resonate over the land, echoing off the trees from every direction. The peaceful land that stood still below him was now awakening as the roots began to stir and writhe through the soil. He steadied his footing and squinted, trying to see through the green haze. The horn itself was a mystery. It came from no particular direction, but he'd witnessed it too many times to ignore it. The needles of his watch began to spin frantically on its axis as the horn steadied its loud, steady pitch. It was a wake-up call. The earth had found its prey and was calling out to the demons that resided. It was also an alarm for a transition. Panic rose in his chest, and his feet instinctively sprinted forward. A second burst of light sparked to his left, and he flinched. His vision faded with the flicker, and he slowed to orient himself. Vines wiggled through the soil, and the branches that sulked and penetrated it were now heaving out of place. Like a bright camera flash, Hal squinted his eyes and waited for the blinding glow to fade. He slowed his pace but didn't dare stop as he cautiously stepped forward. A lashing pain struck his side, and he stumbled. He gripped his bicep, feeling the warm blood trail down his arm as it traveled down. The panic paused, and his feet halted as he watched the droplet fall, flowing through the air before colliding to the ground, instantly shattering that moment into chaos. The mother beast wailed, and the ground trembled with her shriek. The shock wave startled the surroundings as the branches heaved and retreated. The vines below fell stiff under his feet. She was alerted. "Run," Hal whispered to himself, dodging forward without a second thought. The marsh came alive more than ever now, whipping its branches as they searched for its prey. The soil gave with every step, stirring below as the roots gripped his bare feet, pulling him farther. The blinding flash sparked again, dulling his senses. His pulse was deafening in his ears, and he swung his arms for balance before falling. He slid on his back as the cold, murky soil slithered over his skin, covering his arms and chest. With his limbs slowly growing immobile, he steadied his breath as his vision faded back in. The fog settled, no longer rushing in his wake. His body grew cold quickly, covered now in the mud. He lay still, listening as the footsteps came closer. A disfigured foot slowly appeared through the fog and then paused. Although he'd heard the shrieks before, he'd never seen her this close. He held his breath and remained still as he gazed forward. The beast took another step, piercing through the green haze and becoming fully visible. Her structure was almost human-like, but horridly more mutated. She balanced on two main legs that extended forward. The feet were more like claws sinking into the soil as they pierced through. The third leg protruded out the back with an inverted knee. Its foot was flat, used to steady the mass directly above. She walked more like a crab as her spinal cord bent forward at the pelvis, extending upward to the sunken stomach cavity. Large bones stretched the milky white skin of her enlarged chest, and what looked like breasts drooped to the side. Bulging collarbones led to the massive shoulders, and her long arms fell downward, touching the ground. Her hands were claws, with two long fingers and a thumb curled into fists that pummeled the ground as she ran. She took another step forward, sniffing the air, and Hal's eyes migrated upwards. Black veins could be seen through her white, thin skin, rising up her chest to her neck. Bulbs grew on the surface, throbbing with her pulse. She balanced awkwardly on her limbs, shifting back and forth as she tried to pinpoint her prey. Her nose had decayed, leaving the two small holes where a nasal cavity would have been. A protruding brow overshadowed the sunken holes of her eyes below, but Hal could see the large black bulbs as they darted back and forth. Her skin on her face was torn with open gashes that exposed a dark fluid underneath. Patches of the bone stuck out from the jaw and chin, which had mutated into a large calcified surface. She paused only 10 feet away, and the fog fell still. She was nearly within arm's reach, and yet she didn't seem to be aware he was there. The soil beneath him, however, continued to move, and its grip tightened. The echo of the horn stopped, and there was a sudden jolt. It seemed as if time itself had halted. He let out a huge exhale of relief when the transition occurred and the creature froze in place. Everything just stopped. The beast now looked like a milky white body hovering in time, completely motionless and still. The sunken eyes had a hollow white glaze over the dark spheres that remained in place, no longer searching for a target. The grip of the soil also froze and finally allowed him to break free. Pulling his arms from its grasp, he gazed at his watch, which had now stopped its frantic spinning. His body was torn, and a deep cut above his eye blurred his vision even more. Its warmth was almost comforting as the stream slid down his cheek. For the time being, it was a little reminder that he was still alive and able to move. Pulling his other limbs from the veins of the soil, he sat up and tried to orient himself. His breathing was calm now, and he stared at the unbelievable creature as it remained paused in time. No one had ever had this close of an encounter, but he'd heard the groans and wailing from an unseen distance. He'd never believed she existed, or at least not in this form. Another blinding flash appeared, and again he flinched, holding his arms up to cover his eyes. The light remained, and it was no longer merely a spark. He strained as his irises accepted the whiteout. His hearing perked as he faintly heard a man's voice in the distance. The words were muffled but calm, and Hal focused as he tried to make out the words. "Hal Brent, can you hear me? Mr. Brent!" The echoes quieted, and his vision came back. The brightness faded, and Hal's hearing fell mute again. The flash came and went, and as before, it lingered. The voices also returned, quietly at first, and then coherently close. "Hello," Hal spoke, but unable to hear his own voice. "Can anyone hear me?" "Get the oxygen. His lungs are strained." The man's voice came again. The feeling of chaos and movement brushed against his skin. He could feel hands touching his chest and the warmth that came from them. His sensations were fading in and out. One moment the man was close, even touching him, then another moment everything fell numb. The light disappeared, and his vision slowly focused on the surrounding trees and brush of the swampy land. He leaned forward, putting his hands on his knees for support, as his head continued to spin. Was this a new transition? He breathed heavily, again trying to focus on that brief moment of contact, but it didn't come. Several minutes passed, and the world around him became his reality more and more. Was it a hallucination? Was it something new in this bizarre, hellish nightmare he couldn't wake from? He swallowed in protest as he accepted the reality of this cold mud engulfing his feet. His body was completely covered in the mud, and the fog still lingered towards him. The surroundings of the marshland hadn't changed, and he'd been running for so long in so many directions, there was no way to tell which way he was even facing. This was unknown territory, and the fog was different somehow. It was a pale green and drawn to his body, creating a thicker cloud in a small radius. Maybe it was causing these hallucinations. "Hello!" he screamed, desperately hoping for a return as the voice echoed off the trees. These new flashes came and went, and the further he went into the fog, the longer they lasted. He wasn't sure if it was his imagination. The man had known his name. Here he was, alone in the marshland, miles away from anyone, yet the voice seemed so close. The flash came again, unlike before, and the light remained, and Hal's focus was instantly lost. 45 years of age, former Air Force pilot. He's unconscious at the moment. The voice was so close now. He felt as if he were asleep, and he could hear the man next to him, but his mind refused to wake. This was real. Hal could feel the warm blood from the cuts on his arms and chest and the bruises on his bare feet. His arms were outstretched, desperately searching for any nearby surroundings, but with each swing he found himself spinning out of balance. There was nothing to catch himself, nothing to hold on to. His breath slowed, and the blinding light slowly faded to black. "Hold him! Hold! Mr. Brent, you need to calm down! We're losing him!" The voice faded out, and his vision went from blinding white to silent black. There was a deep calm and release as the pain of his wounds disappeared, and the pulsing in his ears quieted.